Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this May 20th, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and you're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can catch my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Now, if you've been listening to my show for the past, year or so, and then prior to that, back in 2007 and 2008, you know that I've been covering in depth the story of the Tony Alamo ministry and basically what happened to this Christian ministry. I've said a long time ago that I believe with the evidence that I've uncovered, and I'm painstakingly uncovered, by the way, by talking to people from the ministry, checking court documents, as much as I could to get to the truth of this story. I feel that the reason that they've been persecuted was because of Tony Alamo and the ministry's stance on the Vatican. And I call it the Vatican-led New World Order. And today on my show I have Burt Krantz. Now, Burt has been a member of the Alamo Ministries for over 43 years. And I believe he's in a perfect position to tell you really what went on behind the scenes and basically how this Christian ministry has been persecuted, showing that really there is no freedom of religion or freedom of the press in this country. Burt, nice to have you on the show. And my last statement, how true do you think that is, there's no freedom of the press or freedom of speech in this country anymore?
Well, that's been gone for a long time, Greg. First, I really want to thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to be here. I really would put that on the churches too, on the pastors and the churches, because they're the ones that gave it all away. They gave the freedoms away. They wouldn't stand up for their rights for many, many years, and then when our rights were taken away, they don't realize yet. Well, now they're starting to see that their rights are being taken away too.
Okay, now you've been with the ministry for over 43 years. Tell us how that started, and give us a little background of some of the things that have gone on behind the scenes, the persecutions, so on and so forth.
Well, Greg, I was brought up a Catholic, and so I really thought I knew all about God. I was brought up on the traditions of the Catholic Church and all the different rituals and things like that, the pipe organ and the Latin Mass. I was an altar boy. But I didn't think anything about God. I always really hated going to church. I think I became an altar boy because my brother was one, and then as soon as I got old enough, I started rebelling against that and stopped going to church, and I stopped thinking about God at all.
It's interesting. We have similar backgrounds. I was brought up Catholic as well. However, I flunked the altar boy test, and they made me an epistle reader. They said they liked my voice, so I had even a better job. But go ahead.
Well, you probably couldn't memorize all that Latin.
That was it.
I didn't know a thing to what I was saying, but I could say the Latin. But anyways, I was really a miserable child from my youth. I would feel conviction over the things that I would do wrong. And God would deal with me as a child that I was not right. That I was a liar, I was a thief, and I became a drunkard at an early age and got into drugs. And by the time I was in college, I was contemplating suicide. And I was at a very low point in my life, and God dealt with me very supernaturally and made me to know that He is alive, He's real, that He wasn't like the statues or the pictures that I'd seen in the Catholic Church or the rituals or traditions that I'd been brought up with, but He is alive, and His Word is true. I began to look into His Word, and I saw that He was a demanding God. He said, lay down your life, pick up the cross, and follow me. And I began to search. I began to try and find what it was that I could do to have my sins washed away, because I knew that God is a God of judgment, and I knew that. But when I read in His Word, He would say, "Seek and you shall find; knock and it shall be opened unto you; ask and it shall be given." And this put a hope in my heart, along with the fear that God had instilled in me. And I went to pastors, I went to priests, I went to even psychiatrists, asking them about this experience that I'd had, and no one really, I found out that none of the people that I had looked up to as religious leaders knew anything about this God that had introduced himself to me. And that's, I think, what I mean in my opening statement, that they gave it all away. People, it seems like they don't read the Bible, or if they do, they read these government-sponsored Bibles that tell us that the government is God. At any rate, at this low point in my life, as I said, God revealed himself to me and put me on this search. And I went around for about a year doing like I said, and the Lord eventually drew me, originally from Massachusetts, he drew me to Los Angeles area in California, and I met brothers and sisters from Tony Alamo's ministry.
Now, when was this? Back in the, the 70s? Or?
This was January of 1972.
Okay. So you meet the people from there. Tell us more. Go ahead.
Well, I was like a hippie, type person, long hair, and it wasn't the type of person that most churches would want coming into their church. But Tony and Sue had people out in the streets preaching the gospel. They had won them to the Lord, and they were out passing out literature, just like you've mentioned many times on your show, how our literature is passed out all over the world. They were passing it out back then. It wasn't as elaborate as it is now, but it had the plan of salvation on it. And I recognized the same spirit that had dealt with me and made me know that God is the truth. The same spirit dealt with me at that time and made me know that these people are serving God. These people are doing what God says to do. They're out in the highways and in the hedges, and they're compelling people to come into the house of the living God. And I checked the church out. I came up, and I experienced the service, and they had what's called an altar call at the end, and asked if anyone doesn't know the Lord to come down and give their heart to the Lord. And I took that opportunity, and I gave my heart to the Lord. And I have to say that God impressed upon me that this is the ministry where I've called you to. It didn't just happen just like that, but over a short period of time, God made me to know that he had called me to this ministry. He made me to know very supernaturally and powerfully. And I know that a lot of people don't think that God talks to people today, but he made our mouths. He made our ears. He can hear everything we say. And he made our mouths. He can hear what we say, and he can speak to us. And he did. He very definitely spoke to me and made me know that this is the ministry he called me to. And
kind of set the stage. I do a lot of shows and have talked to people many times about your ministry. Now, the Vatican and the powers that be always depict this as a cult, as a compound. Now, tell us really what it was like there.
Well, gosh, it was the church itself was an old restaurant that was on the old highway from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, which, of course, had been pretty much abandoned once they put in the interstates. And, we didn't have any money, so to speak of, so we couldn't have afforded to build a compound. They had a little bit of housing, and they were willing to let me stay at the church, and I accepted that offer. And as time went by, none of the people in the church really held jobs or anything. It was a bunch of hippies up the street, and Tony and Sue would have loved to have taken them to other churches and just had them go into other churches. But the thing is, churches didn't want hippies with long hair and patches and, dirty-looking hippie people coming into their church, because it would have scared away their more respectable congregation that was bringing in the money. But Tony and Sue weren't in it for the money. We didn't have any money. And we did begin to work, and we began to accumulate some money, and what we spent the money on was good housing for people. It wasn't fenced-in housing. We bought apartment buildings and single-unit dwellings, and people were, they would get married and have children, and just like anybody in the world. But the only difference is that we were a church that was modeled after the second chapter of Acts, in which we pulled together, and we found that by doing this, we could expend our efforts totally upon the gospel and not worry. I'd personally worry so much about paying the bill next month, because as doing this collectively, as you probably could figure out, we could buy things, cheaper at wholesale, and we could concentrate more on getting the gospel out, and that's what we did. It always was depicted as a compounded as secretive, and yet we're out on the streets every day, even to this day, and going out inviting people to come to our church. We want people to come. We want to tell them what God has done for us, and to know the truth.
But why do you think they singled this ministry out? And what really was your first inclination that they were targeting you and this ministry and Tony?
Well, you've mentioned the Cult Awareness Network. My first awareness was way back then. The Cult Awareness Network was a smaller group, but even then, I'm sure it was a CIA front organization or some government organization that was kidnapping people out of the churches, and they would come and they kidnap people, and they'd actually hold them captive in hotel rooms and browbeat them and just badger them, and the parents would pay like thousands of dollars to have these people do this. Parents that weren't happy that their children had joined ministry. It wasn't just our ministry; it was many ministries this happened to the point where the Cult Awareness Network got sued and lost their status, so to speak, and then they just changed their name and moved into what's now called Wellspring. And rather than being like early on, the Cult Awareness Network people, they would be jailed and even imprisoned for kidnapping, rape, a lot of different crimes that they would commit while doing these what they call deprogrammings. And so instead of doing that now courts order people to go there and be deprogrammed by them. So that's how much the court system has flopped over into the satanic side of the Vatican's plans for humanity.
And I've said many times that I believe that you guys were targeted, Antonio himself, for talking about the Vatican both spiritually and secularly. And what I mean by that is by pinpointing the Vatican as the Antichrist, as the Protestant reformers did in the book of Revelations, as well as pointing out how they work together with our government agencies to silence people who speak up like this. Tell us, a little bit about Tony, what the man is really like, and some of the early persecutions that you experienced there yourself as well as the other members.
Well, Tony won my soul to the Lord. It wasn't just like I mentioned briefly my testimony of how I came to the church, but it was much more than that. After coming to the church, I saw Tony, how he worked tirelessly to bring us up in the Lord. He taught us the Bible, him and his deceased wife, Susan, who really was where this ministry started. The Lord put him together with her, and they worked, like I say, tirelessly to bring us up in the Lord. And when I say that, they like spoon-fed us the gospel, the King James Bible, the true precepts, and to know that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the living God, and not by bread alone. And that God is a severe, he's very loving and very kind, but he's very serious about his word. And he does not like when people distort or take away from his word. He says, if you take away from his word, he'll take away your name from the book of life. Okay, so this is the gospel, and this gospel was contradictory to the gospel that was being preached on the streets. And I really know that not only does the Vatican hate to be spoken of, but they hate to hear this gospel being preached because it wins souls out of Catholicism. I told you, I myself was a Catholic, and most of our church was former Catholics. And many of the souls that we win to the Lord are former Catholics, and when they learn the gospel, it just becomes instant knowledge. When God revealed himself to me, I knew in a second that he had nothing to do with the Catholic Church, because I knew about the Catholic Church. And I knew that this God, this isn't the God I learned of in the Catholic Church. You see, so this persecution was not as above board early on in my Christian life because Susie used to refer to the Catholic Church as a large denominational church and didn't really particularly so pointedly attack the Vatican. But when Susie was on her deathbed, Judge William Overton put out a court order to bring her into court to testify in a Department of Labor case. And this infuriated Tony because this was literally her deathbed. I believe she died the next day. And she sent in marshals to pull her out of her deathbed and to drag her into court to testify. And when Tony did a background check on Judge Overton and on the forces behind this, the Vatican, of course, came up. And so Tony, after Susie died, asked the Lord to give him the ability to write, because we were in this small town of Dyer, Arkansas. And the Lord gave him this gift to write literature. He's won millions of souls. And one of the first pieces of literature that he wrote was that Pope Secrets article, which, as you know, is very hard-hitting. In fact, I believe probably next to Tony's testimony, it's the number one requested piece of gospel literature worldwide ever since, I think it was 1982, 83, when he wrote that. And he would preach to us, we would preach about the Vatican before that, but that's when everything went worldwide. I mean, it just went over the world like wildfire. And our distributors overseas and our affiliated churches overseas, they just took that and ran with it. And my God, it just spread the word throughout the continent of Africa and all throughout Europe and into the Orient, the Philippines, just all over, India, throughout India. And it really won a lot of souls out of Catholicism. And, of course, that made us a very, very pointed target.
And so then the threats start coming, the persecutions start coming, and they start labeling, trying to first put Tony away, which they did on bogus IRS charges. But they also started trying to infiltrate the church with government operatives, correct?
That's correct. And in fact, one of them, I believe, was from my hometown. I mean, I knew the man. And I sent you that article regarding him, how that he was being put forward to try and bring charges against the church that we were rigging elections, trying to bring kidnapping charges against Tony. And the reason that this former district attorney of Fort Smith, Arkansas, was trying to get him to bring these kidnapping charges was because that would bring in the Little Lindbergh Law, which would have been the death penalty against Tony Alamo. Well, this man's name was Scotty, and he found out that they were lying about Tony, and so he bailed out on him and kind of ratted him out. And so it all got exposed, and it all fell through. And then come to find out that this, his name's not coming to me, the former district attorney in...
Reiner, right?
No, the one in Fort Smith, Arkansas. But he turns up to be a rapist and, just all kinds, a drug user and a drug seller and a suspected murderer, because people have died over exposing some of his crimes, sort of like, Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Now, way back in the 80s, and I knew Tony was really getting to the truth regarding the Vatican. At the time I was in Rome, that's how I learned about them. I worked there for 6 years as a journalist. And at the same time, there was a Jesuit priest named Alberto Rivera, and I believe this was in 1984, when he defected and started telling the truth about what the Jesuits were all about. Tony was the first one to bring him in and spoke at your ministry for over a week. And then I said, they will not forget him. They will not forget Tony Alamo. And basically, I tell people to go to your website and listen to those interviews. But I was very, very, it was remarkable that he would give this man a chance to speak. When in fact, Alberto Rivera was then killed by them, by the Vatican.
Alberto was killed, and yes, that was early in the 80s that Tony brought him in and had him, speak at the church, like you say, for about a week. He and Jack Chick both were very amazed at the knowledge that Tony had regarding the Vatican. They would ask him if he'd been there, and he says, no. They said, well, where'd you learn all this? Tony, well, it's in the Bible, and the Lord lets him know, The Lord, Tony would take it first, of course, in the book of Revelation. The Vatican is very plainly spelled out in the Bible. And so, therefore, Tony would assume that all the documentation has to be there, so he would, without fear, say these things about the Vatican, and then the documentation would be found that it's the truth. And it's kind of top-down, you might say. So, just from believing what the Bible says. And as you know, the reformers from the early church, and also in the Middle Ages they knew that the Vatican was the Antichrist because the Bible said so. That's why they knew it. And now, somehow they've got people either not reading the Bibles or reading, like I said, these government-approved Bibles that kind of exonerate different things that the Vatican is into. And they actually change the Word of God, and people want to believe their preacher or whatever their teacher is. And of course the Jesuits are writing all of the curriculum for all the schools, so the children are being brought up not knowing much about the truth about the Vatican.
Yeah, exactly. And when I came back to the States, I wanted to find out, find people who understood some of the things that I learned about them when I was in Rome, and that's how I got to speak with Tony. And so we're going to take a break in about a minute here and come back, and I want to get, in the next half hour, I want to discuss, and I'll give you a few minutes to think about it at the break, this raid in 2008 that I've referenced that put Tony in jail now for 175 years. You know how they've labeled him, what they've tried to call him. I'm going to come back with you and tell me what the man is really like, because I know you had to make a decision in your life, and it was a difficult one. And we're going to talk about what happened to your children, what happened during that raid, the final raid in 2008, when we come back with Burt Krantz. But I did want to say this, Burt, to our listeners. It's amazing to me that even with Tony in jail right now, his spirits are high, and I checked, your website still gets over 300,000 hits every week. So people want to know about this stuff, and they're trying to shut your ministry down, but it hasn't succeeded yet. We'll be back after, we're going to take a 3-minute break. You're listening to the Investigative Journal. This is Burt Krantz of the Alamo Ministry. We'll be back in 3 minutes.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal. My guest is Burt Krantz. He's a longtime member of the Alamo Ministry, telling us what really went on behind the scenes, how this ministry has been targeted, how Tony Alamo has been falsely accused and put in jail for 175 years, and why. And Burt, this 2008 raid, which was very trying on you personally, as well as the ministry, as well as Tony being what I call being put in jail, basically framed. And I've gotten so much evidence, I cannot believe how this court case washed out. It was incredible, the miscarriage of justice here. Touch on that a bit, but go back to the IRS raids and them trying to pin child abuse charges on Tony years ago, and how this never really stopped. And they finally began this whole dismantling of your ministry in 2008. So take us back a little bit and enlighten our listeners.
Well, what you call the IRS raid, the IRS investigated the church since probably the early 70s, at least the mid-70s, and they never could find anything. And, of course, you know that the IRS is one of the Vatican's bulldogs. And they would try, and they never could find anything because our books were kept very, very properly. And so what they did is this judge, Morris Arnold, they got him to make a ruling in back around 1991, that the church really belonged to Tony Alamo, and that they could just come in and take our property. And so a bunch of marshals, they're dressed up in SWAT gear like you see, these commando raids, and they come up onto this property that we had on Georgia Ridge in Arkansas, and they sealed it off because it was like a hill, and the road went up and then back down, and they sealed off both ends of the hill, and all our properties were up there, along with a few of our neighbors, and they stole all the books. And then the IRS brought their charges against Tony. You see. So
Tony had no way to defend himself.
And then in court, I was at that court case, and then they portrayed it as if Tony Alamo had hidden the books. Mm-hmm. You see, so they slandered him so much during and Tony was a very, very is a very, very astute businessman. He was a multimillionaire before he ever got saved in 1964. And he had a store, or it was the church-owned store in Nashville, where the IRS came in and stole, like, I don't know, $5 million worth of inventory, like 3 floors of inventory from all around the world. And also he had formed this Alamo Design, an idea that the Lord gave him of designing these jackets that we made ourselves, and they were very, very popular. The stars were wearing them all over the place, and so they came in and stole all this. And Tony is a very, very shrewd advertiser. He would give these jackets to some stars, and they would wear them. And I don't want to give away trade secrets, but I mean, how much would it cost to have someone like a star modeling your jackets? But we had all these stars modeling these jackets, and Tony modeled them himself. And the IRS would portray this as if Tony was living high in the hog because he was wearing some nice jacket. Then they'd have pictures to show the jury that Tony's wearing some nice jacket. And here it is bringing in the finances that's keeping the church going. And also bringing the gospel out to the world and supplying finances to our foreign ministers all over the world. So they slandered him in that way, and then they said he stole the books, and they put him away for this 4.5 years. And while he's in there, through another court case...
Well, this was in the 90s, correct?
This is in the 90s.
Yep.
Come to find out that we were able to pry out from their agents that they had the books that they were saying Tony was hiding. And not only did they have them, they knew they had them during the case, and they were lying about it. So this evidence came out and was presented to the judge, and the judge he didn't care. Mm-hmm. It's like the truth does not matter. Once they get a conviction, you're had, man. I mean, Tony got out in 4.5 years on good behavior, and then I think 6 months in a halfway house. And they never stopped. They kept trying, and eventually in 2008.
Before we get to 2008, let me just mention this, and I've made this comment. I just wanted to get your reaction to this. I've seen a number of people like Tupper Saucy, who wrote the book Rulers of Evil, and others being framed on bogus IRS charges. And to me, this is kind of like their warning, I believe. They go, okay, you know what we can do to you now. Now, if you keep quiet, play the game our way, we'll stay away. But guess what? Tony didn't. And so I believe that's why they kept going, correct?
Sure. If Tony shut up, of course. Well, Susie used to say many years ago, it's too bad, if John the Baptist had just kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have lost his head.
Yes. And, I'm not laughing, but I know what you mean, yes.
She would kind of say it like that, and it's the same thing. Jesus didn't have to heal people on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. He didn't have to. He could have healed them on some other day, but he stirred up so much hatred against himself that, by and large, the general public thought that he should be nailed to a cross and killed. And generally today it is accepted, even amongst people that don't really like Jesus, that really was an unjust crucifixion. They really shouldn't have done that.
Exactly. And now, they had tried to level charges against Tony for child abuse years ago. That didn't stick. But let's get to this 2008 raid, because they came back at him again, and the ministry hard this time. Yeah, well,
the early on one, there was just a lot behind that, a lot of politics, and they just didn't have any evidence, so the charges couldn't stick on that child abuse charge from the 90s. And so they brought these, they said they were coming in to investigate pornography at Tony's house. So they made this raid, and that's when they ran into the 7 notorious girls that were playing on the swings, and they aimed those laser automatic weapons at their hearts.
And this is in Arkansas in 2008.
If someone had dropped their bobby pin or something, everyone could have got shot. So they didn't find, it seems like if you were doing a pornography investigation, you might come up with one picture. But they didn't find one thing, not one thing. And so they kind of dropped. You didn't hear much about this pornography raid after that happened.
Exactly,
And they always were saying how we were dangerous and we have weapons. We've never had weapons at our church, or they've never been allowed. Anytime anyone was ever found with a weapon, then they were asked to leave the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so they always say these things, and yet here all these agents come and raid us several times, and they've never found a weapon. Did you ever hear that on the news? You never hear on the news how they never, ever found any weapons on anybody from our church. But it is still kind of broadcast that we're a dangerous kind of people. And it's nothing further, it could be further from the truth. But these people, they really are fighting against God. They don't hate us because, of any kind, because we molest their children, or because we steal from them, or because any bad thing that we do. They don't want to hear the gospel that we preach. And we preach a gospel that, like I mentioned to you in the first half, how that God requires that we lay down our life and pick up the cross and follow him. And those people really, they need our prayers, Greg, because these unfortunate people that fight against God, they're going to find out, and very soon, like many people have already found out, because they've gone into eternity. Many people that have had opportunities to help us and instead have ruled against us, and now they know the truth of what they've done. And, it's, a lot of people don't like when you talk about somebody that's died, but some of these judges that have made judgments like that, they ran into the real judge. And, it's not, the Lord doesn't will that anyone should perish or end up in hell, but his word is the truth. And you can't just slander people and steal their children and throw them into prison without warrant, and then expect for God, especially God's people that are Christians, you can't do that and expect that God, you're not going to, there's not going to be a day of reckoning for it. And so, that's why we continue in love to bring the gospel to people that, this Judge Griffin died last week. He's the judge that ruled that I should lose my parental rights. Well, just even from a practical sense, wouldn't it have been better for me if he'd have just repented and said, I really made a bad decision there? It would have been better for me, but also it would have been much better for him.
Before we get into, and we've got maybe 12, 15 minutes to go here, and we're going to come back and do another show, perhaps tomorrow or the next day, if I can. I got to check my schedule, because we're not going to be able to finish what I want the listeners to hear. But, they come after the ministry. I remember even prior to 2008, I interviewed Tony a number of times, and even a government agent informant who was telling me that they are planning something like this. Now, their goal in this one was to convict Tony of child abuse charges, label him as a child abuser, which the media did immediately after that raid in 2008. Over 150 news organizations were notified. And then secondly, their idea was to take away the children of the ministry because they were in a threatened environment, your children included. And thirdly, they want the property, which they've done. They're taking in civil cases right now. Start with Tony. I know he's not a child abuser. Tell us what this man is really like.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've known Tony for 43 years now. And as I said, he won my soul to the Lord, and I've seen him tirelessly work in the gospel field. And Tony, in recent years, before he went to prison, had spent most of his time in study, in prayer, and in writing the gospel literature. And, as you know, he was putting out a radio broadcast every day. And so in order for him to do that, that was requiring for him to do a much study and prayer. And I know that all my children were born and raised in the church, and there, as you know, there was no evidence brought up in court of one iota of abuse that any of them had ever endured. None of them had ever been severely chastened even. I mean, I had good kids. I would chasten them if they needed it, and I chastened them some, but none of them, not one shred of evidence was brought into court that they were abused, and that's why they brought in, oh, well, they weren't vaccinated, or oh, their education, or oh, all these things that they would say in the courtroom, and really once they get you in there, they'll just say anything. And there was 7 to 10, I lost count, attorneys working for the DHS, and they would line up to interrogate you on the witness stand. That's the way that they did it.
Well, tell the listeners how they went about kidnapping these children, basically, from the ministry, including yours. Tell us how that came down.
Well, the first children were taken in that raid, the 7 girls, and then, as you've mentioned many times, the judge put out a order to pick up all children in the church, and many people got away, and I didn't. My children were taken on the roadside in Texarkana, Arkansas.
How many children now were taken?
I have 6 children.
Okay.
They were all with me, and they were taken. In fact, their mother wasn't with me, and when she found out that we were being stopped, she got a ride over to where where the incident was taking place, because it took them a long time to do, I guess, to bring all their paperwork over and take care of the situation. And the mother came over, and of course she was in pieces. Our youngest child was 14 months. The oldest was 12. And
what did they do? They just stopped you and said, give me your children? How did that work? How did they do that?
That's basically, they pulled us over, and they called in about, had to have been 20 vehicles there worth of IRS employees, DHS employees, and officials, and state troopers, local police, just they all got in on the act. There was probably 100 people there, and they all had guns. They had the guns. I didn't have any guns. I couldn't even shoot.
So they had their guns out. Okay, continue. Tell us what transpired from that point on.
Yeah, they gave me a piece of paper, and they took the children, and their mother was so upset and clinging to the children so much that I guess that the IRS, I keep calling the IRS, the DHS, they have policies for that, and what they do is when they take the children, if the mother's like that, they let her get into the van with the children, and they brought her over to the headquarters, and then they took them in there, and that's where they pried the children from her arms.
So this begins your battle to get your children back. Tell us what transpired from that point.
Well, at that point, you go to what's called a probable cause hearing, and then into adjudication, and they lumped us all together. There was, I believe, 7 families that had their children taken. And so they lumped it all together.
What did they tell you? What was the reasoning at that point when you're asking, well, what's going on here? What were they saying to you?
They had a court order.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they had to tell you.
Okay.
That's all they had to say. And they would bring in some of these accusations in the court, just different accusations that people had brought against the church, articles that had been written, things down through the years. And the judge says, okay, there's probable cause that, that we should keep these kids and have an adjudication hearing, or what is it called? Dependent neglect.
Mm-hmm.
To find a hearing to find out. And that thing lasted, 7 to 10 days with these 7 attorneys, 7 families.
Now, where were your children during this period of time? What did they do with the kids during this period of time? You got a 14-month-old.
Oh, my God. The children were taken as far away from us as possible and as close to Little Rock so they could bring them into the UAMS and psychoanalyze them and counsel them and try and rest their minds into, believing that their parents hated them, or that that they had been abused.
Yeah, and this is a pattern. They try to drive a wedge between the parents and basically try to brainwash these kids. Not only yours, but others.
Right?
Go ahead.
That's a science with them.
Mm-hmm.
That's a science with them. They know exactly how to do that. And they put them all into foster homes, and my children were put with they went through several foster homes. Their first foster parent or foster caregiver stole their belongings, and then they were put into a shelter, and then they were brought to an orphanage, and for the most part, they were kept together. The 2 youngest ones were separated from the old ones.
Burt, are you there? Okay, we had a little connection problem, a little internet problem. It dropped our signal, but we're back. We got about 3 minutes more with Burt. Then we're going to bring him back. Do another show because we're just getting started. I think we left off, Burt. Your children have now gone through a foster home. They were put in an orphanage. Their belongings were stolen. You're now trying to fight the court system. Tell us what's going on there at this time.
Gosh, and like you mentioned kangaroo courts, Greg. I really do believe kangaroos would be very offended if you called this. This is a secretive court. They all work together. They have these what they're called CASA volunteers. They're like local socialites, like lawyers' wives and things that volunteer to work with the court to make sure that the DHS harvests plenty of children. And so they work against the parents, and then also you have the DHS attorneys, and there's attorneys that are supposed to be advocating for the children, and they work with the DHS. And then, of course, the judge rules with the DHS. In fact, just to show how much the judge works with the DHS, on the day that he came out with his ruling, when he made his ruling, his verbal ruling in the courtroom, I thought I'd won the case and I was going to have my children. And then the next day, the written order came out, and the written order was written by Mary Helen Mitchell, the lead attorney for the DHS. She wrote it out, and she wrote all this slanderous stuff in there, that none of which the judge had given in his order. And also that I would have to have psychological evaluation, that we would have to follow a case plan, and all these different things that were not in the order. And then the judge signed it.
And this, of course, was going on with the other parents as well, and the other children, too.
Exactly. That's what happened to every one of us.
And this became a huge battle. I mean, you went to the state Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. You tried to anyway. And still, no child abuse was found. But still, you haven't seen your children, correct?
I haven't seen my children since January 2010.
Amazing. It's just heartbreaking that I hear that. Burt, here's what we're going to do. We only got about a minute and a half, so I'm just going to sign off and tell the people that we're going to come back with you and do another show. I want to get into some of the particulars that we didn't touch on today, startling particulars about how they were asking you to lie about Tony. We'll get into that in our next show, which you refused. And it just showed me how corrupt this whole system really was and really is. And my heart just goes out to you that this has happened to you. But just in the final seconds here, tell us how the ministry is surviving today.
The ministry is thriving today, Craig. As you mentioned, there's all those hits on our website, and also the literature is going out, and the Word of God is still being preached. It's not bound. You know, Pastor Alamo was bound in prison, but so was Paul. They put the Lord Jesus Christ in prison, and then they hung him on a cross. And, you know, they did that on a pack of lies, and that's been their modus operandi from then until now.
Okay, Burt.
And,
you know something? I'm going to have to say goodbye right now, but we're going to bring you back tomorrow, and we'll continue with this tomorrow, Burt. That was Burt Krantz. Have a good evening, and don't forget, listen to the Investigative Journal.
Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold, self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188. Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
American Family News, I'm Rusty Pugh. President Barack Obama's trade agenda has cleared a key hurdle in the Senate. By a vote of 62 to 38, the Senate has topped the 60 votes needed to begin action on Obama's bid for